Welcome, everyone, to the Book Triangle podcast.
We're really glad you can join us again.
We're continuing our series, Navigating Modern India. Now, this series, as many of you know, is designed to be very useful.
Yeah, useful for anyone prepping for Indian competitive exams, but also, honestly, for anyone just interested in getting a deeper understanding of India's past.
That's right. And today, we're carrying on with Unit 3. We're diving into Chapter 6, People's Resistance Against British Before 1857.
It's a really crucial period, this, and one that, sometimes gets a bit overshadowed by the big revolt of 1857 itself.
Definitely. But it shows just how much discontent was, simmering across India long before that.
Absolutely. And for this discussion, we've leaned heavily on Modern India by Spectrum. It's a fantastic resource for this era.
It really is. So we'll be unpacking the different ways people push back, how different groups grapples with the growing British presence.
Yeah, the encroachment, really.
So get ready. We're going to explore those early sparks of defiance, the reasons behind them, and the different kinds of people who stood up against colonial rule.
It's quite a story. Let's get started.
Okay, so first off, let's clarify what we mean by people's resistance before 1857. What does that term actually signify?
Right. Essentially, it refers to all those numerous instances, often quite localized, where different sections of Indian society just felt pushed too far.
Pushed by the exploitation under the East India Company.
Exactly. Facing immense pressure, exploitation, they basically chose to rise up and defend themselves. It wasn't, a single coordinated national movement at this stage.
Not yet, anyway. More like pockets of resistance.
Precisely. Spontaneous eruptions, sometimes semi-organized, but happening in different regions. Each one kind of a cry for survival, for dignity.
You mentioned a dire situation earlier. Can you paint a picture of what that actually meant for, say, an ordinary farmer or an artisan?
Well, imagine this. The colonial legal system, the courts, the judiciary, they weren't really there to protect your rights if you were a regular person.
So who were they protecting?
Primarily the British government's interests and the interests of their Indian collaborators.
Collaborators like?
Landlords, especially those who benefited from the new, often harsh land revenue systems. Merchants, too. And, of course, the moneylenders.
Ah, the moneylenders.
Yeah.
Always a key factor in rural debt, right?
Absolutely. They charged crippling rates of interest, often trapping families for generations. And the legal system, it was heavily skewed against the common person.
So if you had a grievance, going to court wasn't really an option.
Very little chance of getting justice, no. The system favored the company and its allies, so this lack of peaceful ways to fix things, well, it essentially forced people's hands.
Push them towards armed resistance.
It became, for many, the only perceived option left. A last resort to survive, to reclaim some autonomy.
And this resistance, it wasn't random. It had roots, a clear genesis in the changes the British brought.
Definitely. And what's really interesting is how different communities reacted, particularly tribal groups.
How so? Were their conditions worse than people on the mainland?
Not necessarily fundamentally different in terms of, say, economic exploitation. Everyone felt that squeeze. But for tribal communities, it was the direct encroachment that was often the flashpoint.
Encroachment by outsiders.
Exactly. Outsiders moving into their traditionally independent areas. You see, these communities had often lived for centuries with a fair degree of autonomy.
Managing their own affairs, their own lands.
Right. Their own customs, governance, often in remote forest or hill areas. Then suddenly you have British administrators showing up, forest contractors wanting timber, missionaries, even moneylenders backed by company authority.
So it wasn't just economic pressure for them.
It was much deeper. It felt like a violation of their autonomy, their whole way of life, which was tied to that land. It was seen as an attack on their identity.
A cultural and social threat, not just economic.
Precisely. The British often saw their systems as, backward, needing civilizing. This direct intrusion felt existential, which is why their uprisings were often so fierce, so immediate. It was about defending their homeland.
That makes sense. Okay,
Yeah.
So these intense reactions were symptoms of a wider problem. You mentioned a complex interplay of factors fueling this resentment. Let's break those down. Maybe start with the economic causes. They seem foundational.
They really were. The destruction of India's traditional economy was systematic. Think about it. India had thriving artisan industries, world-renowned textiles, crafts.
Libby muslin, things like that.
Exactly. Fine textiles, intricate metalwork. But these industries were basically dismantled. deliberately, by flooding the Indian market with cheaper, machine-made British goods, often with very low or no import duties on British stuff, while Indian goods faced tariffs going the other way.
Classic colonial economics, deindustrialization.
That's the term. India went from being a major producer to basically just a market for British factories. Millions of skilled artisans lost their livelihoods almost overnight. Mass unemployment, poverty.
And it wasn't just artisans feeling the pinch, right? The peasantry, the farmers, they suffered hugely too.
Oh, absolutely. Perhaps the most widespread impact. The new land revenue settlements were brutal.
Like the permanent settlement.
That's a prime example. Suddenly, peasants who might have paid a share of their harvest were locked into fixed, often exorbitant cash taxes.
Cash taxes regardless of the harvest.
Exactly. Bad year, drought, floods, tough luck. The tax demand stayed the same. This drove countless farmers into debt. Deep, inescapable debt.
Back to the moneylenders again.
Yes, charging usurious rates. If you couldn't pay, you often lost your land, your ancestral land. This created a huge class of landless, desperate peasants.
And dismantling the old zamindari systems didn't help either.
No, even the older systems, with all their flaws, sometimes offered a bit more stability, a community structure. The new systems often swept that away, adding to the social chaos and debt. It's a legacy, sadly, that still echoes today.
It's staggering. So, economic ruin was a massive factor. What about the political causes? Losing land is one thing, but losing power, prestige, that must have stung too.
Deeply. The political landscape was completely reshaped. Policies like the subsidiary alliance, the doctrine of lapse, these were tools for annexation.
Can you remind us how the subsidiary alliance worked? It sounds quite subtle.
It was clever, in a ruthless way. Indian states were basically pressured to disband their own armies and accept British troops for protection.
Protection they had to pay for themselves.
Precisely. Huge sums, often. It drained the state's wealth, removed its ability to defend itself, and turned the ruler into, essentially, a puppet. Total loss of sovereignty.
And the doctrine of lapse.
That was the one where if a ruler died without a direct, natural male heir, the state would be annexed by the British. It ignored Indian traditions of adoption.
So, rulers lost power, independence, their dignity even.
Completely. Their prestige crumbled. And this wasn't just about the rulers themselves. Think about their courts, their soldiers, their subjects who felt loyalty. Resentment spread.
Even the Mughal emperor wasn't immune.
No, even the symbolic head of the old empire was reduced to a pensioner. By 1835, his title wasn't even on the coins anymore. A huge symbolic blow.
And figures like Nana Sahib.
A classic case. Adopted son of the last Peshwa, denied his family titles, banished from Pune, legitimate heir by Indian custom, but disregarded by the British. These acts created bitter enemies.
So, grand politics aside, what about the day-to-day running of things? The administration, was that a source of anger too?
Hugely. Corruption was apparently rampant, especially at the lower levels. Police, local judiciary officials.
Demanding bribes, harassing people.
Exactly. It made life miserable and eroded any trust in justice. Plus, there was systematic exclusion.
Indians kept out of top jobs.
Overwhelmingly, yes. The higher positions, the ones with real influence and decent pay, were reserved for Europeans. A clear racial hierarchy.
That must have caused immense frustration, especially for educated Indians.
Absolutely. A constant reminder of their subordinate status in their own country. No matter how capable, they hit a glass ceiling.
And the legal system itself. You mentioned it was skewed.
Inherently biased. It was designed to protect the company's interests and the interests of its Indian collaborators, the landlords, the moneylenders, not the ordinary person. So, no real impartiality, a constant source of grievance.
Okay, economic, political, administrative. Now, the socio-religious causes. These seem like they cut really deep, affecting identity and faith.
They did. Many Indians felt the British weren't just ruling, they were actively interfering with deeply held beliefs and practices.
How so?
Well, there was the issue of Christian missionaries. They're proselytizing, sometimes quite aggressively.
Trying to convert people.
Yes. And sometimes openly criticizing Hinduism or Islam. This was viewed with great suspicion, even fear. It felt like an attack on their very identity.
Especially if conversion came with perks.
Exactly. Things like the Lex Loci Act of 1850, which let converts inherit ancestral property, seemed designed to encourage conversion. It fueled fears that the British wanted to impose Western culture, undermine Indian traditions entirely.
And even religious institutions weren't safe.
No. Temples, mosques, other religious places often held revenue-free lands essential for their upkeep. The British started taxing these institutions too.
Taxing places of worship. That wouldn't go down well.
Not at all. It added another layer of resentment, showing how colonial rule permeated every single aspect of life, even the spiritual. It really created fertile ground for uprisings that went beyond just economics or politics.
Right. So we have a whole range of reasons why people were resisting. Now, you mentioned these early uprisings shared some common characteristics, despite being diverse. What were those?
Well, one key thing was that they were mostly localized and isolated.
Meaning confined to specific regions.
Yes, like a flare-up here, another one there, but without much connection between them. They lacked that widespread, coordinated planning or national leadership.
Which made them easier for the British to deal with.
Much easier. The company could focus its superior military strength on one revolt at a time, crush it, then move to the next. They couldn't easily link up to form a bigger threat. That isolation was a major weakness.
And they were largely reactive, not proactive movements for independence.
Overwhelmingly reactive, yes. They were usually direct responses to specific, immediate problems.
Like a new tax or an official's bad behavior.
Exactly. Oppressive land revenue, interference in religious customs, economic exploitation. The aim was often just to fix that immediate problem, maybe restore an older system or get rid of a hated official.
Not about building a whole new nation yet.
Not really, not in the modern sense. It was more about defending their local community, their way of life against a specific threat. Lacked that broader long-term vision of later nationalists.
And their methods. How did they fight?
Mostly using traditional methods of warfare, which, had worked against other Indian rulers, but
not against the company's army.
Not effectively. They usually lacked modern weapons, swords, and spears against rifles and cannons. And just as importantly, they lacked the disciplined training, the logistics, the strategic planning of the British forces.
So bravery wasn't enough?
Sadly, no. Their courage was immense, but they were often outmatched in terms of technology and military organization. A huge disadvantage.
And who led these uprisings?
Typically, leaders came from the traditional elites who were being directly hit by British policies.
Dispossessed zamindars, religious figures, tribal chiefs.
Exactly. People who had lost land, power, or whose way of life was under direct threat. Their leadership was often based on their existing local authority, reinforcing that localized nature.
Which brings us to the final characteristic, how the British dealt with them.
Yes, and that was consistent suppression. The British had the superior military, the discipline, and crucially, the money.
Money from trade and taxes.
Right. They could fund sustained campaigns. And they crushed these uprisings, often with extreme brutality.
Making examples.
Absolutely. Burning villages, executions, harsh reprisals. It was about demonstrating power and deterring others. The difference in military capability usually meant the uprisings were eventually defeated, though often at great cost to both sides, leaving deep scars.
Okay, let's look at some specific examples now. These civil uprisings really bring the resistance to life. How about the Sannyasi Revolt? That one started quite early, didn't it?
Yes, in the 1760s, right after Plassey, as the company was really tightening its grip on Bengal, it was a direct reaction to the economic mess, especially the horrific famine of 1770.
The Great Bengal Famine. Millions died, didn't they?
Estimates say up to a third of the population perished. And amid that devastation, the company was still aggressively collecting revenue. Imagine the desperation, the anger.
And the sannyasis and fakirs, who were they exactly?
Religious mendicants, basically. Hindu sannyasis, Muslim fakirs. They traditionally traveled, relied on alms, pilgrimages.
The way of life the company disrupted.
Completely. New rules restricted their movement, treated them like vagrants. Their sources of support dried up because of the poverty. This, plus the general misery, pushed them to fight back.
How did they resist?
They attacked company factories, raided government treasuries, fought skirmishes. They targeted symbols of British power and their collaborators.
And this is the revolt famously depicted in Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's novel, Anandamath.
That's the one. Published much later, in 1882, but it captures the spirit.
Great.
And it includes the song Vande Mataram, which became so important later. It showed even marginalized groups could rise up.
Fascinating. Okay, moving south now to the Polygar Rebellion. This sounds like it was quite widespread.
It was across large parts of South India, especially Tamil Nadu. The Polygars were essentially local feudal chiefs, military governors.
With their own armies and local power?
Yes, considerable power. They collected revenue, maintained order. When the British tried to curb their authority, impose new taxes, take over, they resisted fiercely.
For a long time.
Decades, really, from the 1790s into the early 1800s. Leaders like Veerpandiya Kadaman, the Marudu brothers, They rallied people, used guerrilla tactics.
And they saw it as a fight against foreign rule.
Their proclamations suggest that, yes, a desire for independence from the company. It shows that spirit of resistance was strong among regional leaders, too.
Okay, then up north again, Haryana. The uprising in Bhiwani in 1809. What happened there?
The Jats of Haryana, known for being fiercely independent farmers, rose up, again likely triggered by revenue demands or other perceived injustices from the encroaching British administration.
And they put up a strong fight.
Incredibly strong. They fortified Bhiwani town itself and resisted the company forces. It wasn't a minor skirmish.
What did it take to suppress them?
A full brigade, infantry, cavalry, artillery, even a heavy battering ram. It shows the determination of these local communities, even facing overwhelming odds. They made the British fight hard for control.
And finally in this category, Diwan Vilutampi's revolt in Travancore, 1808-1809. This links back to the subsidiary alliance, doesn't it?
It's a textbook example. Travancore entered a subsidiary alliance in 1805. The conditions imposed by the British were incredibly harsh.
Financially crippling.
Yes. Huge payments demanded for the British troops stationed there. It basically bled the state dry, caused massive resentment among everyone, from the leadership down.
And Vilutampi was the Diwan, the prime minister?
Yes. He channeled that anger, rallied resistance against the company. He issued the Kundara Proclamation in 1809, a call for a mass uprising against British tyranny and interference, a direct consequence of that alliance policy.
So these civil uprisings show a wide range of resistance. But it wasn't always just about politics or economics, was it? Religion often played a huge role.
Absolutely. Many movements saw peasant grievances intertwined with really strong religious overtones. Colonial rule impacted everything, including faith and culture.
Let's talk about the Wahhabi movement first. It sounds like it was quite significant.
It was an Islamic revivalist movement founded by Syed Ahmed of Rai-Bareilly. He was inspired by Abdul Wahhab in Arabia and Shah Waliullah of Delhi.
What was the core idea?
A rejection of Western influence on Islam and what he saw as corrupt practices within Muslim society. He called for a return to pure Islam, the way it was practiced in the Prophet's time. Strict adherence to Sharia law.
And his followers saw him as a leader, an imam.
Yes, a guide for this spiritual and social renewal. But it wasn't just spiritual, it had a clear political dimension.
Anti-British.
Definitely. They declared British India Darul Harb, a land of war or chaos that needed to become Darul Islam, a land ruled by Islamic law.
How do they organize it? Sounds quite ambitious.
Very well organized, actually. A countrywide network, secret codes for communication, local leaders or caliphas across India, Hyderabad, Madras, Bengal, UP, Bombay.
And they had a base.
Yes. Sathana, in the northwestern tribal belt, was their main operational base. Patna served as a key center within India.
And who did they fight?
Initially, they declared jihad against the Sikh kingdom in Punjab. But after the British annexed Punjab in 1849, the British themselves became the sole target. They fought prolonged campaigns against the British through the 1850s and even later. A powerful ideological challenge.
Okay, connected to that, we have Titu Mir's movement in Bengal. He was a follower of Syed Ahmed.
Yes. Titu Mir, also known as Nithar Ali, was a disciple. He adopted Wahhabism and focused on mobilizing Muslim peasants in Bengal.
Against who?
Primarily against Hindu landlords and British indigo planters who were exploiting them relentlessly. The indigo system was particularly brutal.
Forcing peasants to grow indigo instead of food.
Yes, often on their best land, for terrible prices, trapping them in debt. Titu Mir used religious teachings to condemn these injustices and rally the peasants.
So it being a social and economic struggle, too.
Absolutely. His followers resisted oppressive taxes. It escalated into direct clashes with British police. Titu Mir himself died fighting in 1831. A potent local uprising, brutally suppressed.
Then moving to Punjab, the Kuka movement. Started religious, became political.
That's right. It began around 1840 under Bhagat Jaharmal as a Sikh reform movement, aimed at purifying Sikhism, promoting equality, simpler living.
But it shifted focus.
Yes, especially after the British took full control of Punjab post-1849. The Kukas' emphasis on their own ways inevitably led to conflict with British authority. They challenged British courts, boycotted government services.
And advocated self-rule.
Increasingly so. Ram Singh became a prominent leader, organizing resistance, even setting up a parallel administration. He was seen as such a threat, the British deported him to Rangoon in 1872 after a violent incident.
Back in Bengal, you also mentioned the Narfalbiria uprising in 1831, led by Titu Mir again. What was specific about that one?
That uprising in the 24 Parganas district specifically targeted Muslim tenants against their Hindu landlords.
Highlighting internal conflicts, too.
Exactly. It shows the complexity. Religious identity intertwined with class grievances. The landlords were often seen as collaborators or enforcing unfair practices. Titu Mir tapped into both religious and economic resentment there.
And the Pagal Panthis in Mymensingh, Bengal. Their name is intriguing followers of the Mad Saint.
Yes, led by Karam Shah and then his son Tipu from about 1825 to 1835. This was mainly a peasant uprising against zamindar oppression, high rents, illegal charges.
More socio-economic than purely religious.
It seems so, though it likely drew on shared community and perhaps charismatic leadership, hence the name. Tipu even tried to redistribute land before the British crushed the movement, another example of resistance against landlord exploitation, fueled possibly by religious or communal bonds.
Finally, in this group, the Faraisi Revolt in eastern Bengal, 1838-1857, another religious sect with social impact.
Yes, founded by Shariat Allah, continued by his son Dadu Mian. It started with religious reform focusing on the farais or obligatory duties in Islam.
But moved beyond that.
Significantly, Dadu Mian organized followers to resist landlords, especially Hindu landlords imposing illegal taxes, like those for Hindu festivals, on Muslim tenants. He famously declared land belonged to God, challenging the basis of rent and tax.
So actively challenging the system.
Yes, challenging both the landlords and, by extension, the British system that upheld them. It had strong social and economic dimensions, right up to the eve of the 1857 revolt. Shows how intertwined these issues were.
Okay, let's shift focus one last time to the tribal revolts. You mentioned earlier how vulnerable they were to intrusion.
Yes, living often in relative isolation, their traditional ways were severely disrupted by British expansion and policies. Their revolts were often very direct responses to outsiders coming in, taking resources, undermining their autonomy.
Like the Khasis revolt in the 1830s.
Exactly, in the hills between Jaintia and Garo, led by Tirath Singh, a Khasi chief. The trigger was the British plan to build a road right through their territory, connecting Assam with Sylhet.
They saw it as a violation of their land and independence.
Completely. It wasn't just a road, it was foreign control, loss of resources, disruption of their whole way of life. Tirath Singh rallied the Khasi chiefs, and they fought a fierce guerrilla war for several years against the British occupation.
And further east, the Singhfaz Rebellion in Assam, also in the 1830s.
Another significant tribal resistance. The Singhfaz felt their traditional life and forest resources threatened by British policies and encroachment.
And their resistance became quite intense.
It did. It notably escalated to the point where the Singhfaz actually killed the British political agent in Assam in 1839.
A very direct act of defiance.
It's extremely direct. A clear rejection of British authority. But despite that, like most tribal revolts,
They were eventually suppressed.
yes, the British military superiority usually prevailed in the end. But these revolts, Khasi, Singpho, and many others not mentioned, show just how widespread resistance was, even in remote areas, whenever British actions threatened the core existence and autonomy of these communities.
So wrapping this up, it's clear this period before 1857 was anything but quiet. We've seen resistance from so many quarters.
Absolutely. Civil uprisings, peasant movements, often tied to religion, fierce tribal revolts. Different sections of society were pushing back, even if it was mostly localized and uncoordinated at this stage.
They weren't just passively accepting British rule.
Not at all. The reasons were varied. As we discussed, economic ruin, political humiliation, corrupt administration, fears about religion and culture. But underlying it all was this persistent spirit of defiance.
These weren't just random incidents then.
No, you can see them as the early tremors, the warning signs of deeper discontent that would eventually erupt on a much larger scale in 1857.
And the people involved, these early resistors, their actions mattered.
Immensely. Their bravery, their sacrifices, even in defeat, they set precedents. They provided lessons, inspiration for the later, larger struggle for independence. It highlights that the fight didn't just begin in 1857, its seeds were sown much, much earlier.
It really reframes how we should look at the lead up to 1857. It wasn't a sudden explosion out of nowhere.
Not at all. It was the culmination of decades of simmering resentment, exploitation, and these varied, persistent acts of resistance we've been talking about. This chapter really lays the groundwork for understanding what came next.
Absolutely. We'll continue navigating through this complex history in our upcoming sessions, drawing on Spectrum's Modern India. We hope this gives you a solid foundation, whether for exams or just understanding India's journey.
Thank you for tuning in to the Book Triangle podcast. It's been great exploring this crucial period with you. Please do reflect on these stories, the sheer variety of resistance, and what it tells us about the early impacts of colonial rule.
Indeed. Stay tuned for more as we continue covering the chapters of modern India by Spectrum. Thanks for joining us.